What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Crash Course. I'm not your host, John Green, but I'm Donovan Bullock, and I'm back with another video. And today's episode is going to be about Unit 2. Now. Unit 2, I like to start at the first main point. And I believe the first main point of Unit 2 is mercantilism. And mercantilism is basically when the central or higher government imposes high taxes and tariffs on foreign goods. So forcing all of the colonists' goods and services to go to the one and only mother country. All these high mercantilist policies lead to the main central power source, which is Great Britain, to create the Navigation Acts. And although the Navigation Acts were meant to be a mercantilist policies, the colonists created a strong sense of the American identity and did not listen to these Navigation Acts at all. We can see that the colonies are leading toward independence. That brings me on to what I think sparked the need for independence in the colonies, and that is salutary neglect. And salutary neglect is basically when the British colonies imposed things like mercantilist policies on the colonies, but they did not keep a close eye and close watch on the colonies. And while the British were doing this, the colonies basically created their own American identity. They had own American ways of doing things and had their own American culture. And from then on, with the lower taxation, they were able to build up a sense of urgency and a sense of a need to break away from the mother country. Although not like England or the rest of Europe, the United States still had a serious wealth gap, where the poor kept on getting poorer and the rich kept on getting richer. This wealth gap, it really impacted the Americas later on down in the Revolution, creating a serious class divide between the loyalists, neutralists, and patriots. Donovan, what about the French and Indian War? It looks mysteriously like me over there. We'll be getting to that. It's time for the French and Indian War. Thought bubble! When starting and looking at the French and Indian War, you really have to think, why were they fighting? What was the reason for the conflict? Well, the reason for the conflict, much like most things in the 1700s, were border disputes. And the border dispute was between, of course, the French and the British. Most like uncommon opinion, which most people think that it was between the French and the Indians, but it was between the French and the British. Now when looking at the lasting impacts of the French and Indian War, we can see this, that it really led to the Treaty of Paris in 1763, where the British were given the French land to the Mississippi, and that led to conflicts with the natives with the colonists. Thank you, Thought Bubble. Now continuing to look at those lasting impacts of the French and Indian War, we see this. If there wasn't a spark already for the colonists, now there's definitely going to be a spark. We see the British in the time of salutary neglect, simply because the land is becoming more and more viable. The land is becoming more and more viable. And for the British, this means that the ports are opening and other shipping trade routes are making more revenue and are clearly giving the British something of value to go and look back at the colonies. That's why, sadly, the time of salutary neglect has ended, and we enter into the era of taxation for the colonies. And when I say taxation, I mean heavy taxation for the colonies. It was straight up not a good time for them. Brings me on to another thought bubble. As we go into this heavy taxation period for the colonists, we can see all things start to kick off through the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act was basically the first time a majority of colonies met to oppose British taxes. Other acts of enforcement and power and of taxes leads to groups like the Daughters of Liberty, lead to the Boston Massacre. And the Boston Massacre was the death of 5 civilians as a consequence of British occupation continues. And that leads me to the Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty dumped tea into the Boston Harbor. After all these acts against the British, the colonists probably thought the British would let up, but no, they gave them the intolerable acts, the worst ones of all, which removed Massachusetts' self-government, shut down the Boston Harbor until tea was repaid, forced Boston to pay for housing soldiers, which led to the Quartering Act. That brings me on to the Revolution. Finally, The colonists have been fed up, like what I said, everything with the taxes and the not representation in parliament. It was just too much to handle. So finally, revolution begins. Begins with the first battle, with the Battle of Lexington and Concord. To my second and final battle that I'm going to talk about in today's crash course, and that is the Battle of Saratoga. And the Battle of Saratoga is one of the most important battles in American history, and that is because it showed not only the colonists but the entire world that they had a chance to stand up to Great Britain. And it is because of this battle that the French and the colonists joined forces, and the colonists were able to push the British back and were able to win the war. And on that fateful day in Yorktown in 1781, we saw the American and French troops surround the British army, and on that day, they won their American freedom.
America, hoorah!
Whew, that was a lot, right? Well, it's time to catch up. So the war is over. Everybody's nice and dandy, right? No, wrong. The war might be over, but we still have some socio and economic. And the socio-economic reforms that I was talking about, we can look at all the way back to when the Declaration of Independence was first written. We can see natural rights, and we can see Rousseau's theory of popular sovereignty, Montesquieu's checks and balances, and that leaves me to Voltaire's freedom of speech. And all these philosophers going into the Declaration of Independence and their inputs being put into the Declaration of Independence should lead for people to have natural rights, right? For people to be able to be equal to each other. But as we look after the war, this straight up was just not the case. We see the Iroquois Confederation straight dissolve because of pressures from outside forces like now they're not colonists, now the Americans pressing against them. We see African American slaves, they were promised land and they were promised their freedom during the war, but this just did not happen. Or it could have happened where it really depended on where you lived. Some accounts of people say that the African Americans did get some of their land, but like I said, it really did depend on where they lived in the northern and the southern states. This leads me to the Articles of Confederation, which was the first United States government. However, we all know to this day that the Articles of Confederation did not work at all. Well, I wouldn't say did not work at all, because what the American Congress and the American values and American policies that are still impactful to this day, like the Land Ordinance of 1785, which basically dealt with the grid on which the colonists could settle, and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which basically outlawed slavery in the new forming state. The Articles of Confederation all came crumbling down in 1786 with Shays' Rebellion, and that led us to our new and current day United States government crash course with your host, Donovan Bullock. Please subscribe, like, and even comment in the end. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Donovan Bullock, out.